Good afternoon. I'm Graham Dozier, Publications Managing Editor here at the VMHC, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this noontime lecture in our Scholars Series. As always, we wish to acknowledge the generosity of former trustee Ann Worrell, who endowed this lecture series in honor of our former president and CEO, Dr. Charles Bryan. Now, last Saturday, we opened a brand new exhibition, A Better Life for Their Children, Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America. If you haven't already done so, please make sure you take the time to explore the galleries while you're here to learn more about one of the most transformative educational initiatives in American history. Our next Scholar Series lecture will be on June 13 at 6 p.m. when prize-winning historian Dr. Robert Colby of the University of Mississippi will join us to discuss his first book, An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South. Now, to today's program. Before that, though, if you would please silence any of your little devices, that would be wonderful. Much like the Gettysburg Campaign, many believe that the history of Robert E. Lee's 1862 campaign into Maryland is complete, and that new studies only build off long accepted interpretations of his excursion. But history is constantly reviewed and revised, and as will be demonstrated today, some interpretations missed key sources, misinterpreted evidence, and shaped the narrative along the lines of lost cause ideology. As they demonstrate how these types of distortions continue to shape modern understandings of the campaign, today's speaker will also offer suggestions for how to correct them, and in the process, develop a new understanding of what General Lee hoped to accomplish in September 1862. Dr. Alexander Rossino earned his master's and doctoral degrees in history at Syracuse University, where he taught for 2 years before working as an historian at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington for nearly a decade. Alex is an expert on the 1862 Maryland campaign and the co-author and author of 3 studies on the subject: There, Maryland, the Army of Northern Virginia from the Potomac crossing to Sharpsburg in September 1862, The Tale Untwisted, General George B. McClellan, the Maryland Campaign, and the Discovery of Lee's Lost Orders, and most recently, Calamity at Frederick, Robert E. Lee, Special Orders Number 191, and the Confederate Misfortune on the Road to Antietam. These last 2 books are available for purchase in our museum shop, and our speaker would be happy to sign copies for you. So please join me in welcoming Alex Rossino.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. It's a real honor. Before I go any further, however, I'm going to put you on my Facebook page, so please smile. Thanks very much. So it's a real honor to be speaking here and to be invited to this wonderful institution. It's my first time here, so I'm really happy to have had a chance to come. So today I'll be speaking about the Maryland campaign of September 1862, as you've heard. I'll mix in a few comments about the Pennsylvania campaign of 1863, so you're gonna get a whole Civil War smorgasbord here. But the perspective that I'm offering is a new one, and you can tell from the word new on the slide. And as I proceed, I intend to demonstrate how Lee's first campaign outside of Virginia, which is often portrayed as the Army of Northern Virginia's first invasion of the North, differed from that campaign that took Lee's army across the Potomac River in summer of '63. In the process, I also hope to clear up some misconceptions about Lee's motives and objectives. So, for example, you may have read that General Lee led his army into Maryland to influence the congressional elections in the North that fall. Or maybe you've read that Lee hoped to bring Great Britain and France into the war on the side of the Confederacy. You may have even read that the general entered Maryland because out of a limited number of options that he had at the time, he had no choice but to cross the Potomac. And so these themes have long dominated historical interpretations of the September 1862 campaign, turning Lee's Maryland incursion into what I think is the most misunderstood campaign of the American Civil War. And I'll explain how none of these claims are really accurate or clarify what Lee truly hoped to achieve. Okay. Making sure you can get your slides working is always a real key. So the material I'll be presenting are from essays number 1 and 6 in my book, There, Maryland, which Savas Beatty, publisher in California, put out in November of 2021, and from an essay that appeared in the June 2022 issue of North and South magazine, which, yes, it does still exist. And that was titled Lee's Beaver Creek Plan, the September 1862 battle he had never had a chance to fight, and why that is important. And this essay was a direct continuation of the work that I did in Maryland. It's just that I finished it just as the book was going to print, so it was too late and couldn't be included. So, great. So General Lee found himself in an odd position at the beginning of September 1862. Having driven George McClellan's Army of the Potomac away from Richmond, here, the gates of Richmond in June, and then having routed John Pope's Army of Virginia at Second Manassas, at the end of August, General Lee suddenly found himself with no one left to fight. As Lee later recounted of this moment, and I quote, "The armies of Generals McClellan and Pope had now been brought back to the point from which they had set out the campaigns of the spring and summer, and the objects of those campaigns had been frustrated, and the war was thus transferred from the interior to the frontier, and the supplies of fresh and productive or rich and productive districts were made accessible to our army," unquote. However, unable to pursue the enemy into the fortifications of Washington, Lee elected on September 2nd to push his army north into Maryland. This operation unfolded quickly, with Lee marching his troops to the vicinity of Leesburg on September 3rd. One day later, the first men of his army then crossed the Potomac in 2 places, one at Cheeks Ford and Nolan's Ferry, small nondescript places, into Maryland under the command of Daniel Harvey Hill. So Lee intended to pursue multiple objectives at this point in his campaign, and a few of these are listed on his slide, including his desire to find food and fodder for his army, his intent to draw enemy forces out of Virginia, and his desire to set the stage for a possible incursion into Pennsylvania. In addition, however, General Lee also hoped to draw Maryland into the Confederate fold and to gather recruits for his battle-depleted army. He first expressed this political objective to Confederate President Davis in a dispatch on September 3rd, writing, quote, "The present seems at the most propitious time since the commencement of the war for the Confederate Army to enter Maryland," unquote. And Lee then said that he hoped to take advantage of the demoralization and the disorganization of the Federals after their defeat at Second Manassas. He also wrote at this time that if it is ever desired to give Maryland aid or material aid to Maryland and afford her an opportunity of throwing off the oppression to which she is now subject, this would seem most favorable, unquote. One day later, so on September 4th, Lee added another of his daily letters to Davis. "Should the results of the expedition justify it, I propose to enter Pennsylvania. That is, unless you deem it unadvisable on political or other grounds." So this statement indicates that Lee did initially entertain thoughts of crossing into Pennsylvania, much as he would the following summer. However, scholars of the campaign have remained fixated on this one mention of Pennsylvania ever since, but the question is what Lee meant by the conditional phrase at the beginning of the statement. Should the results of the expedition justify it? And as you'll see later in my presentation, I believe that Lee provided an answer to this question only a few days after he had crossed into Maryland. So in preparation for his campaign, General Lee designed a plan to shift his supply line west into the Shenandoah Valley from east of the Blue Ridge Mountains, which is where his army had crossed into the Potomac River. Expressing this in writing to Davis on September 5th, Lee noted that, quote, "The road to Richmond through Warrenton has been abandoned as far back as Culpeper Courthouse, and all trains are directed to proceed by way of Luray and Front Royal to Culpeper Courthouse to Winchester, which will be my depot." See, Lee anticipated at this time that the Federal stationed in the lower Shenandoah Valley would abandon the garrisons of Martinsburg and Harper's Ferry once they had learned that his army had cut them off from Washington. This would leave the road clear for his supplies from Winchester to the river and from there to Hagerstown, Maryland. These preparations would prove useful to Lee if he decided to push his army farther north or if circumstances forced him to fight it out in Maryland. Whichever such scenario eventually developed, Lee felt certain that the weakened condition of the enemy would give him time to operate on the northern frontier, and that's a quote, as Lee put it, until winter arrived. If the Federals declined to give battle while his army was in Maryland, Lee had hoped at least to annoy and harass them, again, his words, as the opportunity presented itself. But it's very important to understand that his intent was to remain in Maryland and in southern Pennsylvania, forage among the area until winter, because he thought he had the time to do so. So, curiously, General Lee often referred to his campaign as an expedition. This word appeared twice in his September 4th letter to Davis, and he used it again as in his correspondence after the campaign had come to its disappointing end. Now, to be sure, he used the word expedition in a number of contexts throughout the war. In October of 1862, for example, he described Jeb Stuart's raid into Pennsylvania as an expedition. So we can assume that he meant it, he's sort of interchangeable with the word operation, right? But whatever the case may be, expedition also implies that there's a sort of a sense of discovery about what it is that he's doing. And so it's legitimate to ask, I believe, what Lee might have hoped to discover in Maryland once his army had entered the state. So I would argue the thing that Lee most hoped to discover was the strength of secessionist sentiment. He made this clear to Davis in the first letter that I quoted, and he made multiple mentions of it both during the campaign and after it had ended. Now, I've crowded his comments about this subject and both those that he made and are attributed to him onto this slide. You have to remember that they include statements dictated by Lee, because at this time he cannot write. He can't dress himself, and he cannot even feed himself. On August 31st, he gets involved in an accident with his horse Traveler during a brainstorm, where a false cry of Yankee cavalry scared the Jesus out of everyone who was standing around, and Traveler bolted. Ears went back, bolted. Lee decided to hold on to the reins instead of just letting him go. His horse pulled him onto the ground, and he lands on the ground with his hands like this, breaks a bone in his right wrist, sprains his right wrist, sprains his left wrist. So both of his hands during this entire campaign are bandaged from about here all the way down to the middle of his forearm. And then most of the time, he's also wearing his right arm in a sling. So he's not exactly the marble man, the great general, the gleaming, shining knight in Maryland. He's riding in a common army ambulance. He can't dress himself, like I've said, so he's kind of frumpy looking, and so he's hurt. But anyway, back to these statements. So taken together, these provide a body of evidence demonstrating that encouraging Maryland's secession from the Union was among Lee's primary objectives when he crossed the Potomac River in September. Indeed, I would argue that he sought to achieve both a political objective, that being Maryland's secession, and a military objective, the decisive defeat of the Army of the Potomac in the East at the same time. Now, following his initial statement to Davis on September 3rd about helping Maryland to throw off the oppression to which she is now subject, Lee repeated this idea on September 5th. 2 days later, on September 7th, he then complained to Davis about the problem of straggling by Confederate troops. Otherwise known as leaving the ranks without permission, straggling had presented a serious problem here in Virginia. But in Maryland, Lee considered it potentially devastating because, and I quote, "The Army is in a state whose citizens it is our purpose to conciliate and bring with us. Every outrage upon their feelings and property should be checked," unquote. And then one day after this, Lee issued his well-known Proclamation of the People of Maryland. Composed by Major Charles Marshall, a native Marylander and Lee's aide-de-camp at the time, the proclamation struck a note intended to hearten every secessionist in the state. But the fact that Lee signed off on this document indicates that he fully agreed with the sentiments it expressed. And it declared, and I quote again, "Our army is prepared to assist you with the power of its arms in regaining the rights of which you have been despoiled," unquote. This, citizens of Maryland, is our mission. I don't think we can you need to look any further for a more clear definition or description of what it was that Robert E. Lee was in Maryland for. Now, in addition, and it's around this time that Lee uttered a comment which made it into the pages of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Now, this is a piece of evidence that I have never seen in any Maryland campaign study, which is very strange because it's right there in the newspaper, published on September 12th of 1862. And it said, quote, "We have now come to redeem our pledge to the people of this state. We extend the olive branch to them, and should they accept it, we shall welcome and protect them with the assurance that the next battleground will be in Pennsylvania. But should they not come forward after having been amply assured that their property would be unmolested and every guarantee given that the Southern Army should remain on Maryland soil for the maintenance of their sacred rights, then the battleground must hereafter be in Maryland. So I think Lee arranged to have this statement planted in the Philadelphia Inquirer because it was intended to inform secessionists, especially in Baltimore, the corridor from Baltimore all the way down to Washington, D.C., about his plans. I also believe that it's authentic because it is consistent with what he ended up doing and with the sentiments that he describes in other, or he mentions in other documents. Finally, let us consider this comment that Lee wrote in his post-campaign report. Composed in August of 1863, so right after the defeat at Gettysburg, he wrote, quote, "It was hoped that military success, something I think that we could really only define as victory, otherwise there is no success, right? Might afford us an opportunity to aid the citizens of Maryland in any efforts that they might be disposed of to recover their liberties." So given the sentiments expressed in these documents, and I believe the evidence is clear and compelling that Lee led his army into Maryland to encourage the state secession from the Union. I would argue, in fact, that from the beginning of the campaign to his reporting in August of 63, he gave encouraging the secession of Maryland as the reason for his campaign more often than any other rationale, including the feeding and provisioning of his men. So now let's turn to the reasons why General Lee and most of the men of his army might have thought that the conditions in Maryland were ripe for a secessionist rebellion. It's worth recalling that a debate had arisen between Confederate military and political leadership about pushing forces into Maryland soon after the Battle of First Manassas in July of 1861. Jefferson Davis later explained that entering Maryland never occurred at that time because of confusion among them about the war's aims. Were they fighting a defensive war or were there offensive aspects to it? But also because many Green troops in Joe Johnston's Army of the Potomac, as the Army of the Northern Virginia was called at that time, they're volunteers, right? And they thought the war had been won with this single victory, and so they left the ranks. So Confederate strength is actually getting weaker at exactly the time when they needed it to get stronger in order to be able to enter Maryland if that was going to happen. So the result is that Johnston withdrew south rather than moving north, and the opportunity of bringing Maryland into the Confederacy was lost. 1861 also saw martial law declared in Maryland with the state militia disarmed, members of the state legislature arrested, threats of arrest made against the Supreme Court justice, newspapers closed, private property confiscated, and the pacification of Baltimore by armed federal troops. The press, at least here in Virginia, but undoubtedly elsewhere in the South as well, reported all of these events as examples of Lincoln's tyranny, what they had foretold he would do. Those who favored secession became convinced, therefore, that as the first Southerners to have shed blood for the cause of liberty in April of 1861, Marylanders, Baltimore residents in particular, must be ready to rise up in rebellion against Lincoln's administration if they were given the chance. So all of this led to the passage of a resolution relating to Maryland in the Confederate Congress that Jefferson Davis signed on December 19th of 1861. This resolution made it clear that the Congress believed Maryland had been kept in the Union by force, that her people sympathized with the Confederacy, and that they preferred to join the other Southern states in their new republic. And I'm sort of paraphrasing what's the text that's on this slide. The resolution also promised speedy and efficient exertions on our part for Maryland's relief in order to give her people the opportunity to express their true allegiance by joining the Confederacy. So if we compare the text of the resolution to Lee's proclamation to the people of Maryland in September of 1862, it's clear that what Lee wanted them to achieve. And so I've used these arrows here to really show how there's similarity in the comments that Lee makes, or the sentiments expressed here, and the sentiments expressed in the resolution. He promised to give Marylanders the opportunity to throw off the yoke of their oppression, to freely decide their own fate, and to recover their political rights if they chose to do so. In addition, an influential political figure from Maryland named Enoch Louis Lowe Jr. lived here in Richmond at the time, and he worked tirelessly to ensure that the view of Maryland as a hotbed of secessionist fervor became widespread. So just before the passage of the resolution relating to Maryland, Representative James L. Kemper, a man who would later become a brigadier general in Longstreet's command, in Maryland, offered Lowe a seat in the Virginia House of Delegates, representing his own state, Maryland. Lowe turned down the offer in a long public letter that was printed in the Richmond Enquirer on December 16th, so just 3 days out before the passage of this Maryland resolution. And in that letter, Lowe polished Maryland's reputation as a pro-Confederate state by claiming that the majority of its people sympathized with the, quote, great conservative republic of the South, unquote, and that he hoped to join it someday. Lowe also stated that he and other secessionist Marylanders, quote, never permitted ourselves to doubt that the Confederate flag will at the proper time be advanced to the rescue of our people from their cruel thraldom, unquote. It's a great word, thraldom. In short, Lowe gave everyone the impression that Maryland's people simply longed for an opportunity to rise up and join the fight against the despotic Lincoln administration. So accordingly, what did Robert E. Lee do when he entered the state? He camped his army outside of Frederick on the ancestral home, the farm that was the ancestral home of Enoch Louis Lowe, Jr. Now, Lowe's family no longer owned the farm by 1862, but Lowe had been born there, and the property was well known as an old, prominent Maryland farm. Lee then requested in writing that Lowe come from Richmond to join him, and he departed with Jefferson Davis, but neither of them ended up making it across the Potomac. But all of this demonstrates how General Lee entered Maryland to carry out his government's policy of bringing southern border states into the fold. Now, General Braxton Bragg would do the same thing in October by attempting to encourage a rebellion in Kentucky. Concerning Maryland, given ex-Governor Lowe's public influence, sentiment in the Confederate Congress, and Jefferson Davis's own belief that Marylanders just longed to join the Confederacy, is it any surprise then that General Lee and his men believed the old line state would rally to the Southern Army or the Southern Army's call? I don't think it is, but for some reason, this is completely discounted in most histories, if not all histories, of the Maryland campaign. So despite the evidence, histories of the campaign either ignore or deny the importance of Lee's operation of instigating Maryland's secession. And I mean literally deny. There are statements which say that Robert E. Lee never entertained political objectives in Maryland. It was only a military campaign, and that was it. Why might this be? So I suggest there are multiple reasons why so little attention has been paid to General Lee's secessionist ambitions. In the first place, I think many of the post-war opinions offered by former Confederates during the era when the lost cause ideology was being constructed have been accepted at face value. So take, for example, in this context, something that the late historian Joseph Harsh has called Lee's strategic dilemma, unquote. Even casual readers of Civil War history will have run across this sentiment or this idea. And that runs as follows, that after Second Manassas, Lee found himself unable to attack the Washington, D.C. fortifications because his army was not strong enough, and that Northern Virginia was bare of food and fodder after more than a year of war, and so Lee could not maintain his troops where they were. The Western option wasn't practical, meaning moving into the Shenandoah Valley, because it would have, of course, uncover Richmond to a potential strike south if they could find a federal general that can move quickly, strike south, and it would uncover Richmond, basically. Even if Lee had decided to move back toward the Rapidan River and take position on the Rapidan River, he feared the possibility of a waterborne maneuver similar to the one that George McClellan had used in March of 1862, which would have forced Lee to come back to Richmond anyway. So this meant, according to Charles Marshall, who originated the tale of Lee's dilemma in 1876, the general had no choice but to move his army into Maryland. Not only could the state provide food and fodder for his army, it would draw the enemy out of Virginia, providing it with a reprieve from more than a year of wartime devastation. So after Marshall's papers became publicly available in 1927, Douglas Southall Freeman picked up on this, and he included it in his Lee biography, his Pulitzer Prize-winning Lee biography. And historians have been repeating it uncritically ever since. There is, however, a problem. Other than mentioning that he hoped to take the war out of Virginia for harvest season, General Lee never said anything, expressed anything similar to what Marshall said that he did. In point of fact, he wrote to Jefferson Davis on September 5th that if his design to enter Maryland could not be carried out, and I quote, "It is my intention to take a position around Warrenton," unquote, which is about 15 miles southwest of Manassas, and then to maintain his army there. More importantly, from the beginning of September, Lee expressed a desire to get at the enemy, stating that he did not want the fall season to pass without striking another blow. To quote his report on this subject, he stated, "To prolong a state of affairs in every way desirable and not to permit the season for active operations to pass without endeavoring to inflict further injury on the enemy, the best course appeared to be to transfer the army into Maryland." He then confirmed this in February of 1868, stating to Reverend Edward C. Gordon in Lexington that he had entered Maryland to give battle. And to William Allen, the Army of Virginia, Northern Virginia's first historian, at around the same time, that he had wanted to turn the Federals out of their DC fortifications so that he could get at them. So I believe that Marshall's description of the post-Second Manassas situation is deliberately deceptive, and historians have bought into it for nearly 100 years. Marshall framed the invasion of Maryland as a purely defensive option and as the only, very important, and the only choice available to Robert E. Lee. It follows then, because it was defensive in nature and could not be avoided, that Lee could never have entertained the desire to foment secession and rebellion in Maryland. And it was not an act of aggression. It was a defensive, offensive operation. The truth is that Lee intended to do both, and his offensive to be both exactly those things. He intended to bring Maryland into the Confederate fold while leading an offensive that created an opportunity to crush the Army of the Potomac in a decisive battle north of the river. Moving to reason number 2, I think accurate memory of the period has been lost. That contributes to the notion that because Maryland never seceded, Lee's operation in the state could never have been intended to foment rebellion. Most people in the state indeed supported staying in the Union, but secessionist sentiment was strong enough to be a serious concern. So I'll give you an example from the New York Herald, an editorial that expressed this idea on August 26th of 1862, stating, and I quote, "The condition of affairs in Maryland is not satisfactory to loyal Union men. It is well known that the rebels there are openly organized in every county in the state, and that there is reason to believe they are fully prepared with arms and only wait an opportunity to raise the black flag of rebellion," unquote. Concerns such as these, of course, forced the Lincoln administration to suspend constitutional liberties in the state, to implement martial law, to keep thousands of troops stationed in and around Baltimore. These are hardly the acts of a government confident that Maryland can be trusted to remain loyally in the Union, particularly with a victorious Confederate army operating on its soil. And yet these facts are generally not taken into account in histories of the Maryland campaign. An unfortunate tendency toward ex post facto thinking really occupies the field. Generations of scholars have been unwilling or unable to consider the fear and anxiety in northern circles that attended Lee's cross-Potomac march. Now, moving to reason number 3, that's straightforward enough. Ever since he ran for president in 1864, George McClellan's performance in Maryland has occupied the attention of most historians. Accused of advancing at a slow pace, which helped rebel forces capture Harper's Ferry, dawdling for 18 hours after you received key information about Lee's army in the form of the lost orders, and of not destroying Lee's army in Antietam when he should have, McClellan has been the focal point of most Maryland campaign studies. So I believe that as a result of that focus, that there hasn't been as much examination or investigation of what Lee's objectives were. And so it's been poorly understood, the Confederate side of the story. So reason number 4 now brings us to comparisons between the Maryland and the Pennsylvania campaigns. The Maryland campaign is typically framed as a kind of dry run for what ended up happening in 1863, with the motives for that latter campaign also being assigned to the earlier campaign. The Maryland campaign is thus described as Lee's first invasion of the North, with the general intent on making it independent Pennsylvania, but just not getting there on that first attempt. So there are a couple of reasons why I think this interpretation of the history is fraught with problems. The first concerns the idea of Maryland as Northern. Now, while it's true that the state did not secede, and it provided thousands of troops for the Union Army, it also contained a large secessionist minority and provided thousands of troops for General Lee's army. Moreover, it's located south of the Mason-Dixon line, was home to a significant slaveholding population too, especially on the Eastern Shore. So I'd contend that Maryland in September of 1862 was a border South state with strong Unionist tendencies. Now, recent scholarship has revealed that there are strong pockets of Unionism throughout the Confederacy, including up and down the Shenandoah Valley. As a matter of fact, I've heard recently that there isn't a single Southern Confederate state that did not supply troops or at least one regiment of troops to Union forces. So there are Unionists all over the South. One really only need watch the Free State of Jones with Matthew McConaughey, see how far this research has kind of penetrated into the popular culture. And yet only in Maryland's case is unionism conflated with being Northern. I would submit that there's no other Northern state that required the federal government to keep it under martial law and occupied by thousands of troops in order to ensure that it stayed in the Union. Historically and culturally, Maryland was at the time a southern border state caught in the unfortunate position of being between the two warring sections of the country. And this has been really forgotten. What the result is that the campaign in Maryland is all too often called Lee's first invasion of the North. It was actually a very different kind of operation, I would argue. As I mentioned, with bringing the objective of bringing into the Confederacy a southern state that Lee and his army and many across the South, rightly or wrongly, believed that it was kept in the Union by force. Indeed, as I think I've shown, General Lee admitted repeatedly that he took his army north of the Potomac to pry Maryland out of the Union, which is something no one would accuse him of trying to do in the summer of 1863. Now, secessionist Southerners played a part in casting or creating this description of Maryland as a Northern state. Bitterness about the fact that Marylanders didn't rebel when General Lee gave them the chance caused them to disavow the state as authentically Southern. I would argue, however, that this opinion was not really clear in 1862. Now, it evolved during the war, for sure, and it's clear in the differences between how Lee's troops treated the people of Maryland when he was in the state and how Jubal Early's troops treated them in July of 1864. During Lee's time there, his troops generally behaved very well. They didn't steal things if they could help it. They tried to pay with whatever money they had. Most of them had just Confederate scrip, which wasn't accepted by most Marylanders, but some did accept it. And they had to forage out of necessity. But depredations carried out at this stage of the campaign, the latter stage around Sharpsburg, contrast with the reports elsewhere where Lee's men were generally well behaved and did not take things. Now, contrast this with the rough handling of Maryland's people in July of 1864 during Jubal Early's march. Maryland at that time was 6 months into the process of abolishing slavery in their own state constitution. And Early treated the people of Hagerstown, Middletown, and Frederick as harshly as he did the people of South Central Pennsylvania in 1863. He levied ransom payments, he requisitioned supplies, he threatened to burn down entire towns if they did not pay up. These acts make it clear that by the summer of 1864, the Confederate perception of Maryland had changed from thinking of it as a state as a sympathetic ally in the border South to an antagonistic state in the border North. So this change of perspective is understandable given what happened during the war, but I would argue it doesn't apply to the earlier period when Lee was in the state. Finally, this brings us to Pennsylvania as the target of Lee's operation. Now, the general may have begun the Maryland campaign with the intent of entering the Keystone State, but as I will show, he abandoned this idea almost as soon as he had reached Frederick. Finally, there's a statement that Lee wrote to Davis on September 7th, which historians frequently cite as proof that Lee never intended to stoke the flames of rebellion in the state. Writing, and I quote, "Notwithstanding individual expressions of kindness that have been given and general sympathy in the success of the Confederate States, situated as Maryland is, I do not anticipate any general rising of the people on our behalf," unquote. Now, scholars have long clung to this second part of this statement, but I would argue that the more important part is the conditional phrase in the middle. Lee's writing at this time is filled with conditional phrases. This one is situated as Maryland is. So what did he mean by this? So this slide illustrates the situation at the time. I'm sorry that it's blocked out there in the middle. It should be more opaque, but I had to change the colors because of the quality of the camera or the projector up here. So this slide illustrates the situation at the time, sharing a long line with Unionist Pennsylvania and occupied by thousands of federal troops, especially in that corridor right there in between, because that's where the rail line runs. So especially in that corridor, situated as they were, secessionists in Maryland could never hope to bring their state out of the Union. That is, unless the Army of Northern Virginia could provide them with some protection. Lee expressed this evolution in his thinking in his campaign report, which I quote at length on the right side of this slide, but I'll paraphrase his tortured language. And as you read through it, it is tortured to make sense out of what he was trying to communicate. The man was the master of writing in the passive voice, which is completely opposite of how I write. So he wrote that the condition of Maryland under martial law and occupied by federal troops encouraged him to believe that the Lincoln government would retain all of its forces in the state to prevent the rebellion that he hoped the presence of his army would encourage. He appreciated the difficulties that surrounded Maryland's people and understood that they would not rise up unless his army proved that it could defend them. He thought it could do this by winning a victory in the state, giving secessionist forces proof that his army would protect them from federal reprisals. And influenced by these considerations before he left Frederick, Lee therefore put his army in motion. Now, this language describes an important pivot point in Lee's understanding of the situation. Whereas he had previously assumed that the mere presence of his army would inspire an uprising of secessionists in Maryland, he now saw that the difficulties that faced them could only be overcome by winning a victory in the state. Of course, Lee had already planned to do exactly that, but the fact that he now openly conflated his military and political objectives represented a significant change in his description of the situation. So it's therefore dwelling a little bit on how this came about. So on September 6th, the day they crossed the Potomac at White's Ford, General Lee attended a dinner in Frederick at the invitation of some influential local secessionists. And I believe this dinner probably took place at the home of Reverend John Ross, the minister of Frederick's First Presbyterian Church. And that's the parsonage where he lived at the time. And this is the church that's right next door. One of the great things about living near Frederick is that you can go to these places and see these places where this history happened. It's interesting. So it was at this meal that some of the guests asked why Lee had come, which probably took him aback, right? This situation prompted, and as he put in a letter to Davis a week later, the citizens were embarrassed as to the intentions of the army. So it prompted Lee to order Marshall to write the proclamation. That's why he ended up writing a proclamation on September 7th, which he then had published on September 8th. So it's also during this period between September 6th and 9th that Lee made the statement that showed up in the Philadelphia Inquirer on the 12th. But at the same time, he also learned two developments on the military front. The first being information from Jeb Stuart that a federal army had finally started making its way away from Washington toward him, and from Captain Elijah Veers White, the commander of a cavalry battalion from Loudoun County, Virginia, that the Federals had not abandoned Harper's Ferry as expected. So I believe it's at this point that Lee's political and military objectives became fully interwoven. Convinced that he needed to win a victory in Maryland and to bring about the state's secession, he was eager to come to grips with the enemy as well. So he designed Special Orders number 191. Now, I'm not going to go into detail describing the operation against Harper's Ferry. Instead, I'll concentrate on a few key points to illustrate the evolution of Lee's plan to confront the Federals in Washington County, Maryland, west of the Blue Ridge. So just to orient you a little bit here is the Blue Ridge Mountains, or here are what's called South Mountain in Maryland. It's really just an extension of the Blue Ridge. These are the Catoctin Mountains with Frederick here. And Lee designed this plan to encircle Harper's Ferry from three different directions using three different commands under the whole command of Thomas Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. And then he wanted to bring them back together up here in Maryland. So Lee commanded the 4th column himself, the one that moved from Frederick up towards Hagerstown. And it included 9 brigades of General Longstreet's infantry, the infantry division of D.H. Hill, the reserve artillery, and the Army's immense baggage train. That column was supposed to march to the vicinity of Boonesboro, just west of South Mountain, and stop there to await the successful conclusion of Jackson's siege of Harper's Ferry. On September 11th, however, Lee received word of two things. One is a large supply of flour in Hagerstown being removed by federal troops that he desperately needed for his army because these men are starving at the time, and of a large enemy force that was approaching down from Pennsylvania as well. So he ordered Hill's division to stay at Boonesboro with the train and move the rest of the army that he had with him up to between Hagerstown and Funkstown, little town up there. That created a 5th column. So it's during this march that Robert E. Lee saw high ground behind a place called Beaver Creek, located 3 miles north of Boonesboro. Standing as high as 560 feet in some places, the heights are extremely steep on the right flank, and that side of the ridgeline is also hemmed in by Antietam Creek, while on the left flank, the heights run nearly to South Mountain. Overall, the position is a very strong one to defend and difficult, although not impossible, to attack by the flank. So in the first place, Lee wrote in paragraph 9 of Special Orders number 191 that the commands he had detached at Harper's Ferry were to join the main body of the army at Boonesboro or Hagerstown. That's a quote. Once they had accomplished their objective. It's worth remembering that General Lee did not know exactly where he would make his stand when he dictated his orders. He simply looked at the map and went, this looks like a decent place, far enough from behind the mountains and far enough north to induce the enemy to follow. He wrote that in his report. He had hoped to induce the enemy to follow him west of South Mountain by threatening Pennsylvania. And that's a quote. He wanted to threaten Pennsylvania, not enter Pennsylvania. In other words, during his stay near Frederick, General Lee abandoned the idea of entering Pennsylvania in favor of using it as bait to draw George McClellan after him. So after Harper's Ferry had been taken, he intended to reassemble the detached parts of his army, call up his stragglers and supplies from Winchester, and crush the pursuing enemy. When he saw the heights behind Beaver Creek on September 11th, he decided they were served the battleground for the coming fight. And by assuming a strong position, Lee thought he could defeat the demoralized and disorganized enemy far from their reinforcements and the protection of the D.C. fortifications. There would be no repeat of the Battle of Second Manassas this time, when he had watched his army rout John Pope's army not to be able to follow up. This time, if he defeated McClellan's army, which he fully expected to do or didn't see any reason why he wouldn't do it, and they fled, Jeb Stuart's cavalry division could hunt them down and destroy them in pieces as they tried to make their way back to DC. This would hopefully allow him to march on Baltimore or Washington. He never really said which one, and bring Maryland into the Confederacy and hopefully end the war. So this slide shows the vicinity of the Beaver Creek area, and the heights form a sort of shallow inverted C that stretches for almost 3 miles around the perimeter of a level area north of Boonesboro. So this entire area is heights here, and this is flat, mostly flat. This quarry here was not there at the time, so please try and ignore that. But it has multiple points of ingress and egress and it's hemmed in by Antietam Creek to the west. So ironically, if Lee had had a chance to fight here, this might have been called the Battle of Antietam, even though it wasn't, right by Sharpsburg. And the heights roll upward in shelves, very similar to the hills around Fredericksburg. And so this would have allowed Lee to have defended a position very similar to Fredericksburg. With the artillery above the infantry, it would have created a perfect killing zone like that, which it cost Ambrose Burnside nearly 13,000 dead and wounded at that battle. The left flank of the Confederate position is also only partially vulnerable, as you can see on the slide, to being turned because of the narrow space between the heights, the end of the heights and South Mountain. So McClellan could have only maneuvered, say, 2 brigades worth of troops against that, not 3.5 corps like he did so at Sharpsburg. It's a very strong position to defend had Lee been allowed to fight here. So how do we know that Lee chose the heights behind Beaver Creek as an intended battleground? There are several pieces of evidence. First is on the evening of September 13th, after he had received messages from Stuart and D.H. Hill warning him that a large federal force had suddenly been sighted at the eastern base of South Mountain, he wrote a letter to Lafayette McLaws, who was in charge of the forces that were at the southern part of the operation against Harper's Ferry there along the Potomac River, writing that that General Longstreet will move down tomorrow and take a position on Beaver Creek, this side of Boonesboro. Second, according to a northern woman, a New Yorker who lived in Funkstown on the morning of September 14th. So on the morning of the day of the Battle of South Mountain, Lee sent a runner through their town, warning them that a fight was about to occur, and he would do the best that he could to try and give them time to evacuate if the fighting came close. So that lets people know that that he was pending or was expecting a fight to break out in their midst at any time. Funkstown is 4 miles behind the Beaver Creek position, so it would have been in the Confederate rear at the time. And then finally, on the day of the Battle of South Mountain, General William Nelson Pendleton, the commander of the Army's artillery reserve, reported to Lee just outside of Boonesboro. And in his report, only 10 days later, he wrote, and I quote, "When I arrived and reported to you a short distance from the battlefield, you directed me to place in position on the heights of Beaver Creek several batteries of my command." This was done just before nightfall. So in other words, even as the fighting is raging on South Mountain, General Lee still remains intent on defending this line, this Beaver Creek line. Finally, there's substantial evidence to show that on the morning of September 14th, Lee did not come to D.H. Hill's aid as early as he should have. Histories of the campaign will tell you that Longstreet's command departed for Boonesboro at daybreak. This is based on claims made by both Longstreet and Robert E. Lee after the war. But the truth is that Longstreet's command did not get underway until at least 8 o'clock, maybe even closer to 9 o'clock. And that's when Lee heard cannon fire suddenly coming from South Mountain. This told him D.H. Hill was under attack and needed reinforcement. Longstreet then subsequently made a very intense severe force march that reduced his combat strength by 50%. So why General Lee would keep Longstreet from departing at dawn makes sense if we take into account his plan to fight at Beaver Creek. Stating after the war that he had never intended to defend the passes of South Mountain, but wanted to draw the Federals west of it for a clash in Washington County, he probably considered ordering D.H. Hill to pull back to the Beaver Creek position to fight for the battle he wanted to fight there. Remember, Lee anticipated this time that Harper's Ferry would fall. It was encircled by the 12th, that it would fall on the 13th or the 14th at the latest. So he was probably waiting on the morning of the 14th for word from Jackson that the garrison had capitulated, and then he could bring his army back together. Lee could bring his army back together where he wanted to fight. Instead, he ended up having to defend the South Mountain passes so that McClellan's forces can't punch through the different passes and threaten Lafayette, McLaws, and Richard Anderson. So, as we know, the defense of South Mountain gaps failed and forced Lee to withdraw in the direction of Sharpsburg. He even contemplated abandoning Maryland altogether, and until the long-awaited message from Jackson arrived at around 8 o'clock on the morning of September 15th. And at that point, Lee then decided to make his stand on the heights outside of Sharpsburg, which bear a very remarkable similarity to the look of the heights at Beaver Creek. So they're very similar. So wrapping up, I'd like to just offer a few thoughts on the implications of viewing the campaign from the perspective I've just outlined. First, I believe my interpretation of this evidence provides an explanation for why General Lee fought at Sharpsburg or Antietam, but it's been long missing. Because historians have forgotten or ignored his political objectives, they've lacked a way to explain why Lee would have assumed so dangerous a position with his back to the river and only one rocky ford to leave his position. Instead, historians have resorted to psychoanalyzing Lee, arguing it was his disdain for George McClellan that led him to fight, or in the case of one historian, to argue that Lee never intended to fight there in the first place. McClellan forced him to fight there. Secondly, the truth is that Lee sought from the beginning of the campaign to bring Maryland into the Confederacy. And after September 7th and 8th, he believed he needed to fight to win a victory in the state in order to make this happen. In other words, Lee decided that his army would spill blood to bring Maryland into the Confederate fold, and he stood at Sharpsburg in order to do that and slugged it out with the enemy. Third, I think this interpretation of events demonstrates the importance of the loss of Special Orders Number 191. Debate about this subject has long focused on McClellan, but when it came to Confederate operations, it completely wrecked Lee's plans. It then forced him to bring his army back together faster than he had anticipated. So this created a couple of different knock-on effects. One is Lee had to take an ad hoc position at Sharpsburg, meaning he never planned on it. He had never seen the place before, didn't know the terrain or anything, but he saw it and went, oh, this looks like a good place to fight, and he did so. It turned out, however, that his left flank was in the air, and that caused real problems for him because of the amount of men that McClellan was able to throw against his left. The other thing is that it weakened Lee's army significantly. There are several reports, for example, of the commands that finally reached the battlefield, and they have 50% losses or 40% losses simply from straggling. Lafayette McLaws, for example, when his command went into the fight at the West Woods, it suffered enough. It suffered tremendous casualties, of course, because it's a very, very intense fight. And the next day, it had made up all of those casualties for men that had returned from the ranks who had simply fallen out of the march on the march to Sharpsburg. And then lastly, I would like to say that this interpretation of the campaign, I think, demonstrates just how different it was from the Pennsylvania campaign of 1863. Lee entered Maryland to stay in the border south to pry it out of the Union. He did not do that in 1863 when he went to Pennsylvania. So I would argue that it's accurate to conclude that General Lee's army invaded the North only once, and that's in June of 1863 to fight in early July at Gettysburg. And so with that, I will thank you very much. And we have 10 minutes, I guess, for questions. And there's a microphone that Graham has down here. So if you raise your hand, he can bring it over to you. Oh, there's one back there too.
Okay. Hello. Yeah, I had a question.
Yes, sir.
You talked about Unionist sentiment throughout the Confederacy. Could you characterize the percentage of it, maybe compared with Loyalist sentiment during the Revolution?
I wish I could. It's not a subject that I'm an expert in. All I know is that I've seen examples of it in different places. I'll give you an example from the lower Shenandoah Valley, the town of Martinsburg there. It was known as being so Unionist and this is right in the heart of Jackson's area of command, right? It was so Unionist, they called it Little Massachusetts. So that's how bad it was. So I mean, there was sentiment from what I understand. The Shenandoah Valley was filled with a lot of Germans who had moved down through the Cumberland Valley from Pennsylvania, and they settled in the Shenandoah as far south as Richmond or Lynchburg, and they were more Unionist than secessionist. But I'm sorry, I don't have a specific answer to your question. Yes, sir.
Did Lee intend to continue the campaign after the Battle of Antietam? For example, move north? I've heard that Lee's intent had been to, all right, we're stalemated here, we're going to move north toward Williamsport. Do you know anything about that?
He never said anything. At least I've never found any document that says anything about what he had intended to do after the battle. However, I find it really hard to believe that he would have wanted to march north for a couple of reasons. One is that a quarter to a third of his army has no shoes. And the turnpikes in the north, the Valley Pike that goes up into Chambersburg and then Harrisburg, that's macadamized. And so is the National Road is macadamized. And macadamized just simply means it's gravel, right? So if you're barefoot, the last thing you want to be walking on is gravel, right? The other thing about these gravel roads is that they tear up people's shoes at that time. So there are stories that you can read from both the Union Army and from the Confederate Army that say, even though we had this fine road to march on, it tore up the underside of my shoes so badly that I ended up having holes in my shoes. So that's one reason. The other is you have to remember what at least according to my reading of the evidence is that what was Lee's objective, and his objective was to bring Maryland into the war on the side of the Confederacy. So I would think that he would probably have marched toward Baltimore in order to inflame the opinion there, because he's won a great victory, right? So go to Baltimore, collect all the secessionists, and then you cut off Washington from the north. So Lincoln has to abandon Washington, D.C. So what effect does that have on the war? Does it bring the Europeans into the war? Maybe. Does it force him at least to move the capital to Philadelphia or to Boston or New York? Definitely. So how far does it set back the Union effort? So we might not have had a war, say for all intents and purposes, Lee ends up winning Antietam, goes to Baltimore, brings Maryland into the Confederacy, but the Union remains, in the war, and everything kind of proceeds the way that it proceeded afterward. Maybe we're talking 1866 instead of 1865 for the end. It might have prolonged things, but it's hard to know. Yes, sir.
Do you personally like Robert E. Lee?
I never met the man, but I have a great admiration for his loyalty or for his sense of duty. because regardless of whatever you think of the cause he fought for, he believed in it, and he believed that it was his duty to do what he thought was right. And I admire that, because I don't think there's any sense of duty really among most people nowadays. So I admire it. I wouldn't say like. I also admire U.S. Grant, because that man he never lost a battle. He's the most successful military figure probably in U.S. history. So you have to separate admire from like. Yes, sir. Nope, she went that way.
Well, I want to say thank you for your presentation to begin with. I've been a student of the war most of my life. I guess my initial question is, the loss of Special Orders number 191, you didn't talk much about, but is that overrated in history in terms of what forced the outcome of this Maryland campaign? In other words, that wasn't as critical militarily as it could have been made out to be, because it sounds like the Army of Northern Virginia didn't do a great job defending South Mountain, and that may have changed the whole layout of how the battle was going to be fought.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that it was absolutely critical to the outcome of the Maryland campaign, and for three reasons. One is it kind of galvanized McClellan, even though McClellan had already begun pushing Lee as early as the 8th of September. Lee ends up, remember, Lee thinks that he can stay in Maryland and Pennsylvania until winter. Now, all of a sudden, he's been in Maryland for 48 hours and there's an enemy army coming at him. And he's like, whoa, what's going on here? So that's one thing. So it galvanizes McClellan into attacking those passes at South Mountain, because he needs to rescue Harper's Ferry. That creates thousands of casualties in the Army of Northern Virginia that Lee could not afford to lose before the big engagement that he wanted to fight. So it splits the big engagement that Lee hoped to fight into two separate engagements: the Battle of South Mountain and then the engagement at Antietam. But when Lee's army ends up fighting at Antietam, some of the estimates go anywhere from 36,000 to 42,000 men, give or take. When Lee entered Maryland, his army was probably around anywhere from 55 to 63,000 men. So he's lost, through straggling and casualties, he's already lost almost a third, if not half, of his strength. And so McClellan, moving in response to those orders, forces these forced marches from Harper's Ferry, Longstreet's from Hagerstown, McLaws all the way from the southern part of the Pleasant Valley area, which is even farther away, because he has to cross the Potomac River. Then he has to, so it causes 50% casual or 40% straggling on the days before the attack. McClellan's attack. And then it also forces Lee to fight at a place he never intended to fight. He picked out his field. He knew where he wanted to do it, and he couldn't fight at his own battlefield. So that tells me that McClellan actually had more advantages than he even knew at the time.
And I don't want to dominate, but it leads me to the other question that I've often wondered. Did McClellan, we talk a lot about Lee here in Virginia,
Sure.
But did McClellan miss out on a really big opportunity with discovering lost orders? In other words, if the situation had been reversed, Lee as a general made better use of finding lost orders maybe than McClellan did. Did he miss out on a huge opportunity?
I don't think he missed out on a huge opportunity. I think he took pretty good advantage of it. I mean, he marshals those attacks against the South Mountain gaps. His men march into the night. They march until about 1 o'clock in the morning. And then the reveille is at 3 a.m. and they're back on the road again. So they get 2 hours of rest outside of Frederick. So I think McClellan did a great job with that. I think that his management of the Battle of Antietam is really a problem, and that's where he ended up failing because he wasn't active enough on the field himself. Robert E. Lee's on the field the entire day. He's under fire most of the time, and he's directing where he's ordering McLaws up and putting him in where he needs to go, et cetera. McClellan's back across the Antietam Creek, looking through a spyglass going, oh boy, I'm doing a great job, aren't I? Yeah. So, and read Scott Hartwig's I Dread the Thought of the Place, and you'll see there's even more missed chances than we even knew about before that McClellan had to really destroy Lee's army there.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
Perspective and your study
Thank you. No,
And
I'm-
just what it means to people like us who have always wanted, like you say, some of these perspectives or the narratives are formed throughout history and people buy them as truth.
Mhm.
And then you do further research, you go, there's more to this than what we thought.
There's way more to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, just being able to answer the question that I always had myself, which was, why did Lee fight at Sharpsburg? It doesn't
Right.
make any sense.
Mhm.
Right. But now I know, because he hoped to bring Maryland into the fold and he was willing to spill blood to do so.
Have you done some research about the Gettysburg?
No, I've never done any work on Gettysburg. No, that campaign has got hundreds of people working on it. I mean, something like 18,000 books have been written on Gettysburg. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Were there any? Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't have I can't see very well.
So when did Lee recover from his injuries? When could he feed himself again and get dressed? Was that like a month or so? Or-
Yeah, about the middle of October, he writes that he finally has some use of his hands again.
Oh my gosh.
Yep.
So he was just in pain for a good deal of
He-
this whole thing.
He was, and there's an argument that's recently been made by a man named Stephen Stottlemyre, who's a licensed battlefield guide up at the Antietam National Battlefield, that Lee may have been under the influence of laudanum
Oh, very
for
possible.
at least the early part of the campaign, or some kind of painkiller, because I mean, he's got broken bone in his hand, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a question as to exactly how disabled he was and how cloudy his thinking was when his plans were developed and when he was carrying out the basic sort of foundation of his campaign. By the time that the fight happens at Antietam, I don't think there's any evidence that he was really disabled other than physically. I mean, mentally, foggy or anything like
Right.
that. As a matter of fact, he fights the Battle of Sharpsburg really well.
Was Traveler injured or?
Traveler wasn't injured, and
Well,
Lee
he
also, I found, this is another strange and interesting thing, is I have found no evidence that Lee rode Traveler at Sharpsburg. None.
Oh.
The only time,
Give
there's
him a
only
break, huh?
one, there's only one source that says what kind of horse he was on, and he said, and it's a small black horse.
Oh,
I have no idea what it was.
wow.
Traveler was probably too powerful, too much for him to handle
Yeah,
with
I
his
gotta-
with
yeah,
his
with
hands
the
being,
injury.
because he does ride under his own power
Right.
for at least part of the day.
Okay, well, thank you.
Were there anything else?
That's it. Alex will be upstairs. Thank you.